So, we haven't necessarily been getting a lot of Kaiju number 8 recently, and for a manga that rather consistently for the last 2 years dropped 3 chapters a month, and that's unfortunate timing when you consider the fact that this manga just began its anime adaptation a couple of months ago when these manga release issues started. It's even worse when you consider the fact that we may be approaching the end game of Kaiju number 8 as a story. However, the lack of chapters that we've gotten over the last couple of months has not decreased the quality of the chapters that we have gotten. In fact, the last few chapters of Kaiju number 8 feature some of the largest twists and turns we've seen in this story. And chapter 117, the first chapter that we've gotten in 2 weeks, is absolutely no exception to that rule. See, because in chapter 117, not only did we get 25 pages of incredible kaiju fighting manga, but we also got some incredible exposition about the earliest version of kaiju fighters. How they gained the strength to battle against kaiju that were on par in strength with the kaiju that are battled against today with modern technology like guns and kaiju suits. And we're learning all of this from a flashback that Kafka's currently experiencing with the samurai that was initially shown to us in chapter 66 of the manga. And this samurai was presumably the first ever user of Kafka's kaiju powers. Or he is a physical representation of Kafka's kaiju powers. See, it's really hard to say, but that is the question that chapter 117 poses. See, because for the first time in the history of Kaiju number 8, we are finally beginning to crack away at the mystery that is Kafka's powers. And the answer appears to be way more metal than even I anticipated. So with no further ado, let's get directly into answering some of the largest lingering questions in the Kaiju number 8 universe, because today we're talking chapter 117 of Kaiju number 8, Explained. Before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. If you're wondering where the Dawn to Dawn reaction series video is this week, it's gonna be posted in a couple of days, but Kaiju number 8's not posting another chapter for a month, so I figured let's do this first. So chapter 117 of Kaiju number 8 starts off exactly where chapter 116 left off. Chapter 116, when we last checked in with Kafka, he was in a form of unconsciousness sinking to the bottom of a lake, thinking about how he's willing to give up anything to fight alongside Gen, Hoshina, and Mina. As they battle against the, I don't know, demonized version of Kaiju number 9? The eyeball version? What are we calling him? Anyways, while Kafka was sinking to the bottom of that lake, an apparition appeared in front of him. The samurai who appeared at Ryuni's shrine in chapter 66. And that samurai told him to come with him in order to form a stronger connection with us, not me. And that's important. And at this point, the Kafka is zapped into the past, into the body of a samurai. And he finds himself on a battlefield, standing there, dumbfounded on the front lines. And before Kafka knows it, the call to charge is screamed out and an army of samurai run past him. But he doesn't move because, understandably, he has no idea what's going on. And as this army of samurai sprint past Kafka, you realize they're charging a kaiju. This kaiju does look somewhat like Kaiju number 2. The kaiju that's being charged isn't any of the identified kaiju so far as we know, but it does have many of the same characteristics as identified kaijus, at least pre-Kaiju number 8, because most of the identified kaijus post-Kaiju number 8 were more humanoid, while the identified kaiju pre-number 8 were mostly reptilian, looking kind of like Godzilla or a giant salamander. So I feel pretty confident when I say that the kaiju being battled against here was most likely at least a Dai kaiju. But anyways, this army of samurai charge this kaiju, and Kafka remains standing there, and people are bumping into him and asking him if he's gone weak in the knees, which causes Kafka to pan around and go, where am I? Is this an ancient battlefield? He then thinks about the call to charge and looks around him and realizes that everybody is either just using bows and arrows or giant staves. Well, everyone's using giant naginata, which is a staff with a blade on the end of it, which was commonly used in Japan, especially by samurai in army settings. Kafka looks down at the naginata in his hand and the armor on his body. He realizes that both the armor and the weapon were derived from kaiju, but because they don't have the added benefit of modern science, all of these tools derived from kaiju are in their rawest state. And therefore, the way that humans were able to tap into the power of the kaiju is by using the parasitic tissue of a kaiju in its rawest form and crafting that into weapons and armor. However, because it hasn't been optimized over the course of hundreds of years of kaiju fighting, this not only doesn't lead to a massive increase in strength, but it also apparently puts an astronomical strain on the body. So it's more work for less best results, which is kind of the entire idea of science improving things. Now, while Kafka's dumping all of this exposition to us, he's still very much on an active battlefield, and therefore apparently a Yoju, which I doubt for a reason that I'll get into in a second, fires a laser beam at Kafka that he has to be saved from. Now, the reason that I doubt that it's a Yoju is because a Yoju is usually a smaller kaiju who accompanies a Honju when they break out of the ground, and it certainly didn't look like a Yoju to me. Anyways, the person who saved Kafka starts to yell at him, saying, "Why are you spacing out? This isn't like you," which seems to imply that Kafka has replaced somebody in the past. Most likely the samurai who he's always seeing and interacting with. And it's at this point that it's revealed that the person who saved Kafka is actually Vice Captain Hoshina's ancestor. And to Kafka, Hoshina's ancestor says, "You're gonna make the Saru squad captain weep." Now, Saru means monkey in Japanese, and Tora, which is identified to be another squad in a second, means tiger. So it appears as though, in the ancestral times, the squads of kaiju fighters fell under zodiac names. And it appears as though Kafka has entered into the body of a Saru squad member. And Hoshina's ancestor appears to be the captain of the Tora squad, as he commands the Tora squad to stay to the left and head for the trenches. We then cut back to the kaiju, who's now been tripped up. And now that it's stuck in one place, the army calls for the firing of their cannons. And yes, Japan absolutely had cannons in the 1600s. China created something known as the Fire Lance between 1000 and 1200 AD, which was effectively the first ever gun. Trust me when I say cannons got to Japan by the 1600s, especially the late 1600s, where Kafka most likely is right now. And thus the downed Yoju apparently gets bombarded by cannon fire, which puts Kafka in genuine awe of them as he looks around and says, "I can't believe these people use this technology to fight kaiju. People are so soft nowadays." And it's this point that the samurai that Kafka is maybe replacing right now begins to apparate behind him, saying, "Today is a day like any other, slaying kaiju while sacrificing many of our own, carrying out the same harsh orders we always carry. Or so we thought." And it's at this point that a giant explosion of bodies happens in the back line behind Kafka. And after Kafka looks over his shoulder at the launched shower of debris and gore, the samurai tells Kafka, "We were faced with that thing when it emerged from a body." Now, most likely what I'm assuming is being said here is that after the kaiju was killed, the entity that's currently taking over kaiju number 9 came out of that kaiju. And this seems to be corroborated by the fact that the gigantic kaiju that emerges on the battlefield does kind of look like the kaiju that they were just fighting and just bombarded with cannon fire, except, you know, for more arms and the giant slit down the middle with all the eyes. And thus it appears as though back in the most ancestral form of kaiju fighting, this multi-eyed, multi-armed monster that's taken over kaiju number 9, or possibly is kaiju number 9, existed, and close to the level of strength that it exists as today. Because the samurai talking to Kafka goes on to say that we as a fighting force had no means to defeat it. And that is immediately corroborated by what I can only describe as some of the goriest panels we've ever gotten from kaiju number 8. This newly awakened undoubtable Dai kaiju is sweeping its hands through masses of samurai and bisecting them by the dozens. And as all of this is going on, Kafka is trying to tell people to get away from the Dai kaiju and that he'll take it on. But as Kafka is playing through all of these memories, the samurai is still narrating to him, telling Kafka it didn't matter how fast the soldier was, how strong they were, if they were said to be the greatest swordsman in all of creation. And it's at this moment that we see Hoshina's ancestor pierced through the chest and dangled over the mouth of this kaiju. And this, as Kafka associates Hoshina's ancestor with the Hoshina he knows, infuriates Kafka, so he grabs his naginata and charges the kaiju. But as he does, the samurai narrator says, "All were equally decimated." And as this is said, we see that Kafka's legs have been cut clean off. The kaiju then continues to go on a rampage, finishing the last dregs of the army that once thought it killed it, as Lieutenant Kafka slowly but surely crawls to the kaiju. But there's nothing that Kafka can do. His body is thrown as if it weighs nothing high into the air, while the narrator tells us our comrades, the fields we worked hard to till, the homes we were supposed to return to, our families, the creature stole them all. While all of this is being said, we can see the kaiju rampaging across Japan, destroying everything in its sight. As he sinks, hands begin to creep onto his chest. As the narrator says finally, We were helpless. We then see as Kafka is sinking down into the bottom of the depths of this water that presumably the ghosts of all of the warriors who were killed in this battle are crawling onto Kafka and saying, "The shame, the shame, the shame." And once again, in bold lines, it said, "We were powerless." And these ghosts begin to cling to Kafka and mass around him, making a bubble, or I guess the more apt comparison would be making a cocoon around Kafka. Because with the final 2 pages of this chapter, the narrator says to us, like insects, we were powerless. And with the imparting of those final words in this chapter, we see in the place of where Kafka once was, where the cocoon once was, is now the kaiju that exists inside of Kafka. And thus, we now know exactly where Kafka's kaiju powers came from. See, kaiju number 8 is not a kaiju in the traditional sense of the word. See, because if we assume that kaiju number 8 is the only kaiju to be made this way, and that kaiju in actuality are beings that exist somewhere either at the bottom of the ocean or the center of the earth and crawl their way out to consume humanity, that means that kaiju number 8 was humanity's response to the kaiju infestation. It's very clearly being shown to us that the souls of kaiju fighters amassed around the samurai that we saw at Ryuni Shrine, and that the souls and shame of all of those soldiers and their inability to defend their homes, their fields, their family, amassed down into kaiju number 8. But what does this mean? Does this mean that the samurai that Kafka has been seeing and probably took the place of in the memories of these ancient battles is actually kind of like the heart of the kaiju that lives inside of him? And therefore, instead of being the original user of kaiju number 8's power, is in actuality just the physical representation of that kaiju power to Kafka? We can't necessarily say. However, considering the fact that Kafka, who was embodying this soldier in the battle, turns into kaiju number 8 in the bottom of this lake, seems to imply that rather than that samurai being the user of this power, that samurai is the power. And this is corroborated by the fact that Kafka saw this samurai at Ryuni Shrine, because Ryuni Shrine is a shrine built for one purpose and one purpose alone: to give thanks and to pray to those who were killed in the combat against kaiju. And so, if kaiju number 8 is a physical representation of those who have died in combat against kaiju, humanity's response to a kaiju that humanity wasn't strong enough to defeat by themselves, then it would make sense that in the first circumstance that Kafka ever interacted with this samurai, who could possibly be the physical apparition of his own kaiju powers, that would happen at Ryuni Shrine. Explains why the kaiju inside of Kafka had such a visceral response to seeing kaiju number 9 break down into its most basal form, the Dai Kaiju of the Meiriki era, because it was that kaiju that had been battling against the Dai Kaiju of the Meiriki era 400 years ago. But then again, it is a substantially cooler idea that this kaiju was inside of a samurai, like it is inside of Kafka, and that samurai was using a naginata to slice up the Dai Kaiju of the Meiriki era. Regardless, Kafka's kaiju being formed like this raises more questions than is Kafka the first person this kaiju ever wriggled inside of. Because while earlier in the video we did try to establish the fact that this is the first kaiju ever created this way, we don't know that. The idea that the bad guys of this universe are created from the negative thoughts, shame, and despair of humans is not a new idea. It happens in Bleach, it happens in JJK, it happens in a ton of universes. And therefore, more so than the fact that we're seeing how Kafka's kaiju was made, this chapter might be just showing us how kaiju are made in general. Because this kaiju was specifically created by an entire group of people whose entire life was dedicated to killing kaiju, it would make sense that this kaiju and this kaiju alone would actively be in the pursuit of killing other kaiju. Now, unfortunately, we can't say any of these answers are 100% accurate, but in a manga that's almost now 120 chapters long, this is basically the most exposition we've ever got. And for that, as your resident information guy, I'm thankful. But unfortunately, with information, so comes a bunch of questions. Because if it's now being established that Kafka's kaiju has existed for almost 400 years, where has his kaiju been? Has it been treating itself like a tailed beast in the Naruto universe, hopping from host to host whenever that host dies? If so, who are the other hosts? Were they as powerful as Kafka? Because the only host that's even been implied to exist up until this point has been the samurai who was seen at Ryuni Shrine. On top of that, will this event of figuring out how his kaiju was created allow for Kafka to bind to his kaiju completely? The answer is most likely yes. And Kafka, now understanding what he didn't understand in chapter 113 when kaiju number 9 took him to that ancient battlefield, will allow for Kafka to reach the true heights of his power, most likely reaching a 10 magnitude reach. And now that Kafka has truly bound with us, and once again I bring that us point back up because it's very important, he'll be able to defeat kaiju number 9 once and for all. Presumably a battle that's been going on for 4 centuries. But to quickly circle back to that us point, because I forgot to talk about it earlier, the reason I believe that the samurai wasn't the user of the power and was rather just the power itself is because the samurai said that Kafka needs to form a connection with us, implying that all of the souls that climbed onto Kafka and the masked samurai make up the kaiju that Kafka is currently trying to connect with. And therefore, to finish this video out, if we're assuming that the samurai saying us implies that the samurai is the power rather than the user of the power, that would explain where Kafka's kaiju has been for the last 400 years. Because if there hasn't been previous users of kaiju number 8, then kaiju number 8 could have been dormant or trapped somewhere for those 400 years. And not until the kaiju that almost killed Kafka in the beginning of kaiju number 8 emerged was kaiju number 8 also simultaneously free. But that's a whole lot of speculation, and we're gonna have to wait 28 whole days to get answers to any of these questions. But if you guys think I'm heading in the right direction, tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you excuse me, I have to go film the Dawn to Dawn reaction.